Star Trek The Next Generation is full of interesting characters, but there is none quite so mysterious as Q, the all-knowing, all-powerful being, for whom the Enterprise crew is a mere curiosity or plaything. Q is the show's most popular recurring character and is about the closest thing the show has to a villain, though to frame him merely as such would be far too reductive. His true purpose in the show is much more nuanced, and despite only appearing in 8 of its 178 episodes, Q is one of Star Trek's most enduring enigmas. So in this video, we're going to reflect on what we know about Q, who he is, what he is, and how his character holds up a mirror to humanity. Let's start with how Q was conceived by the show's creators, because his origins are more humble than you might guess. His first appearance is in the show's pilot episode, Encounter at Farpoint, but he didn't actually appear in the first drafts of the script. Gene Roddenberry co-wrote the pilot, and one of his intentions for this opening episode was to establish a mythical scope for the series. The idea was that humanity would be put on trial, that the entire series would be a test of the human condition. A literal trial was written into the story, and they soon realized that the trial needed a judge. Now, this character was not necessarily intended to be a major recurring character, but when John Delancey was cast in the role, the greater potential of the character became apparent to Roddenberry. The original character was not necessarily written as playful. It was actually rather solemn. It was Delancey's interpretation of the character as mischievous that impressed Roddenberry and led ultimately to his further development in the series, though Roddenberry smartly limited Q's appearances in the series so that viewers would not come to expect him anytime the Enterprise crew found itself in an inexplicable situation. I think Delancey's instinct that the character should be mischievous rather than malevolent is very interesting, as is Roddenberry's reaction, and I suspect that it's because this type of character is a very common and very ancient trope in storytelling in many different cultures. Q is the trickster, and we'll look at a few examples throughout this video that illustrate what that means. Now, a few important things about Q are established in Encounter at Farpoint. First and foremost, while he may often appear in human form, he is in fact a member of an alien race, referred to as the Q Continuum. Very little is divulged about this race in the TNG series, but we know they are immortal and nearly, but perhaps not totally, omnipotent, if that's possible. They exist on an extra-dimensional plane beyond human comprehension and are not bound by our narrow concepts of time and space. In fact, they can control and manipulate reality in ways that, as far as humans are concerned, make them gods. Now, Q himself does not hold humanity in very high regard, calling them a savage child race, not worthy of exploring the galaxy, and this initial disdain for humanity plays out as contempt for the Enterprise crew, and especially of its leader, Jean-Luc Picard. As I've argued before on my channel, Picard's character is meant to represent the highest ideals of humanity, so Q is really the perfect foil. He considers Picard to be arrogant and naive, the precise opposite of how we, the audience, are meant to see him. So right from the first episode, the dynamic between these two characters, their moral chemistry, opens up a huge range of narrative possibilities. It formulates the basic premise of the series. How do the highest human ideals hold up in an uncaring universe? Q continues his experiment the next time we see him by giving the powers of the Q to Commander Riker, and therefore posing the question, what happens if a human being is given unlimited power? Q makes a wager with Picard that Riker will be tempted to use his powers. Riker gives Picard his word that he will not, but when he has the opportunity to save a little girl's life, he realizes what a challenge that will actually be. In the end, he offers to cure the Enterprise crew of their personal struggles, turning Wesley into a square-jawed jock, restoring Geordi's vision, and giving Worf a Klingon mate. But each of them rejects Riker's offer, arguing that they would lose the very thing that makes them human, or Klingon. But what's really fascinating about this episode for our purposes is a conversation between Q and Riker, in which Q admits that the reason the Continuum has taken such an interest in humanity is that they fear that humanity will one day become something more powerful than the Q, and it's the compulsion to learn and explore that Q is threatened by. I think the most interesting fan theory about Q is that they are in fact humanity at an extremely advanced stage. The idea being that humans at some point in the far future reach a final state of evolution, perhaps even evolving too far, only to become so bored with their own existence that they look back on themselves with a kind of nostalgic amusement. So it's possible that Q's help is ultimately what makes them Q, which is exactly the type of mind-altering paradox that makes Star Trek so good. This theory kind of fits with Q's next appearance, in which he warns the Enterprise about the true dangers lurking in the galaxy. The episode Q Who is one of the most influential pieces of storytelling in the history of science fiction, and definitely deserves its own video, so get subscribed. This time, Q's experiment is much more serious. The Enterprise is flung 7,000 light years away into an unexplored region of the galaxy, at which point Q disappears and leaves the crew to its own devices. Just a quick aside here, one curious thing in this episode I want to mention is Guinan's reaction to Q. They clearly have some kind of history and are not on good terms. She raises her hands in this kind of defensive posture. Q calls her an imp, suggesting that she's not what she seems. And the most interesting implication here is that Guinan, the ship's wise bartender, is perhaps equal in some capacity to Q. I've always loved this little mystery, and I'm thrilled that it has never been fully explained. Anyway, the crew soon encounters an alien race called the Borg, which conceptually is one of the most brilliant alien races ever imagined, not only because they're a nightmarish portrait of human-machine integration, but also because they're the perfect nemesis for Captain Picard and the ideals that he and the Federation represent. The Borg can't be negotiated with. They don't care about diplomacy. They don't care about anything. All they do is consume without regard for individual life. Now, we all know that the Borg would go on to become the most popular villains in the Star Trek universe, but it's important to remember that this episode is as much about Q as it is about the Borg. The thing that's so interesting about this episode is that it has a very unsettling moral. In the end, Picard recognizes that Q is doing humanity a favor in warning them about the Borg, but he thinks it could have been done without the loss of several members of his crew, to which Q responds,
"If you can't take a little bloody nose, maybe you ought to go back home and crawl under your bed."
Oof, that line is chilling. It's unsettling because in the end, Q's moral position is a valid one, despite the fact that he caused serious harm. So paradoxically, it's the first time in Q's character arc where you get the impression that he might actually care about Picard and humanity more broadly. Whether the ends justify his means remains open to debate. This brings up one of the most important features of Q's character, and that is his moral ambiguity. He's neither good nor bad, and his actions might have a deeper purpose than might be apparent. This is one of the defining features of the trickster archetype, of which there are many famous examples in literature and myth. Coyote is a figure in Native American myth who is very Q-like. He's a shapeshifter. He travels between different realms of existence. He's at the beginning of the world, and he can alter reality at a whim. Most importantly, though, he teaches lessons by way of disruption of the natural order, often exposing human folly by causing trouble. That's Q. The next time we see him is in Déjà Q, which is the reverse experiment of hide and Q. This time, rather than granting a human unlimited power, we see what happens when an omnipotent being becomes human, by having his power limited. This episode is the source of the famous facepalm meme, in case you didn't know. So Q is banished from the continuum, which itself is a fascinating and perplexing development because it suggests that the Q are, despite being nearly omnipotent, still a society with rules and norms that can be violated. Q, it seems, is, even by their standards, a bit of a mischief maker. In fact, we learn that Q is guilty of tormenting an alien race called the Calamarain, who sees upon his sudden vulnerability as an opportunity to get revenge. We get another mysterious interaction between Q and Guinan, in which she accuses him of torturing other life forms for his own amusement. So it should be noted that there is an aspect of Q's character that might actually be somewhat malevolent rather than merely mischievous. His failures to integrate with the crew are highlighted by his conversations with Data, who finds it ironic that Q has achieved the thing he desires the most. Like Data, Q fails to understand the finer points of being human, but unlike Data, he's repulsed by his newfound humanity. Data saves Q's life, causing him to feel ashamed of his own selfishness, and it's only after committing an act of self-sacrifice that Q is permitted back into the Q continuum. This is granted by another Q, who himself seems slightly shady, raising the question of whether the entire continuum is made up of troublemakers, although the fact that they hold self-sacrifice as an admirable ideal has interesting implications. His foray into mortality and the tedium of a narrow human existence is played more for comedy in this episode, and this is capped off nicely in the final scene, in which Q conjures a mariachi band onto the bridge of the Enterprise and leaves Data with a parting gift, the experience of laughter. But the question we're left pondering is whether Q, the all-knowing, might have actually learned something from humanity, even if he would never admit it. Q might remind you of another character from literature, Puck. He is the servant of Oberon, the Fairy King, and his most famous appearance is in Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. He's the guy who mistakenly enchants the wrong lovers and turns one character's head into that of a donkey. You'll find that aspect of the trickster in the episode Cupid. It's the one where the crew is transformed into the characters from Robin Hood so that Picard can save an old flame from Nottingham Castle. This episode doesn't have much to say about Q except that he has a sense of humor, so I won't dwell on this episode. Suffice to say that Q might have also been a convenient device for the show's producers, who occasionally wanted to put the crew in more outlandish scenarios and to give the series its signature levity.
I protest. I am not a merry man.
True Q, on the other hand, has a lot to teach about Q's nature, and again, it's surprisingly dark. A young woman named Amanda, who grew up believing she was human, begins to show signs of having Q-like powers. Q shows up to test her, and ultimately to bring her back to the continuum. However, his reasons say a lot about the morality of the Q continuum. It's revealed that if she does not want to join the continuum, Q will destroy her by order of the continuum. There's even this really creepy moment in which the continuum is represented by this sinister shadow.
Your progress, Q.
As anticipated, there are some problems. I need time.
It turns out that Amanda's parents were also Q, but chose to live as humans. The deal was that they could only leave the continuum on the condition that they never used their powers. But according to Q, they were unable to resist and so were executed by the continuum in the form of a freak tornado. Now, before we judge the continuum for this harsh policy, let's consider their reasoning. According to Q, it's because they cannot allow an omnipotent being to exist in the galaxy without some reassurance that he or she will act responsibly. This shows us that there is a moral code in the continuum, which is really fascinating. Amanda's story approaches the question of omnipotence from an interesting angle. She is tempted to use her power to see her deceased parents, and there's a scene in which she poses the question to Dr. Crusher. If she could bring her husband back, would she? But Amanda quickly realizes that her power is both a gift and a curse. The more she uses her power to live out her fantasies, the more she realizes that the experience is hollow. There's also a scene in which Q and Picard compare human morality with that of the continuum. Picard's proposition being that the Q, despite their omniscience, are incapable of having a moral center. Now we arrive at Tapestry, a story in which Picard apparently is fatally wounded and appears to reach the afterlife. Lo and behold, Q is there to greet him, claiming to be God.
You are not God.
Blasphemy.
It's revealed that Picard actually has an artificial heart, resulting from a knife wound he received in a bar fight with the Nausicaan, known cheaters at Domjot. Q offers Picard something that I'm sure many of us have fantasized about at one point or another, an opportunity to relive our past and to rectify the mistakes of our youth. Jean-Luc Picard, it turns out, was not always the stalwart and morally upright character we know him as. Turns out he was a bit of a rogue in his younger years. Well, not this time, because now Picard is wiser, and he's going to erase the mistakes of his past. But as we watch this alternative version of Picard's life play out, it becomes clear that the only reason Picard ended up being wise is because he made mistakes when he was young. So, having now prevented those mistakes from happening, Jean-Luc Picard grows up to be a low-ranking officer. He never took risks, he always played it safe, and he never amounted to anything. Luckily for Picard, Q brings him back to life, leaving him with a profound life lesson. Now, I always felt that this was one of the kindest things that Q ever did. It's less about giving Picard a warning, and more about just giving him a gift. It's all too easy to regret the decisions we've made in our past. What's more difficult is to imagine where the alternative decision may have led. So it's just interesting to see that Picard and Q's relationship towards the end of the series is actually more amicable, almost as if both characters have come to understand and respect each other a little more. Now, before we get to Q's final episode in TNG, I should mention that his character does appear in several other Star Trek series after TNG. He features in 1 episode of Deep Space Nine and 3 episodes of Voyager. The most interesting of these is an episode in which Q actually gets bored of existence and wishes to become mortal. We get to see the Q continuum, which is depicted metaphorically as a desert road stop, which is pretty interesting. I should also mention that he plays a major role in the 2nd season of Picard. Personally, I found this characterization in the series off the mark. Q is dying in that series, despite being immortal, and with no explanation really given, and his relationship with Picard is portrayed as if they're old friends. This kind of sentimentality is often the fallback of poor writing. The relationship has no real substance beyond the thin premise that Jean-Luc and Q loved each other all along, and in my view, it fundamentally misunderstands these characters and their relationship. So, by the time we get to TNG's finale, we're ready for some kind of moral resolution to the original question posed at Farpoint. After all he's seen of the Enterprise and its crew, what verdict will Q render unto humanity? The final episode of TNG involves a spatial anomaly which threatens to stop life from ever forming on Earth. Paradoxically, the anomaly is caused by Picard's effort to prevent it. The only chance Picard has of saving the galaxy is to open his mind to the non-linear nature of time, which Q is all too happy to help with by shifting him through time periods. In the episode's climactic moment, in which 3 Enterprise crews from 3 different time periods sacrifice themselves, Picard finds himself suddenly back in the courthouse where everything started, with Q before him. And it's Q who gives us the moral of the story, not just of the final episode, but of Star Trek The Next Generation in its entirety. And because the show is so well written, there actually is a natural moral conclusion. And it's simple: the trial never ends. Humanity never stops growing. But interestingly, and I think this is also the main point of Q's character, he says exploration is less about what's out there and more about the inner possibilities of conscious existence. And in keeping with Q's character, not much more than that is given, because the writers recognize that more than that really cannot be given. It's a beautiful and thought-provoking conclusion to not only the series, but to a character who plays almost as much a role in defining the series as Picard himself. And for that, I believe much of the credit must go to John Delancey for helping this character to really leap off the page and to embrace and continue the deeper literary and cultural tradition of the trickster character. As for what Q actually is, we're of course never really meant to know. He is the great mystery personified, and that is how he ought to remain. So thanks for watching. Check out my Patreon if you'd like to support this channel, and I'll see you on the next one.